It's the 12th of June 1942, and hungry Parisians are soaking up the emerging rays of the summer sun while their occupiers mill about them. After more than 2 years under the Nazi yoke, things are looking increasingly dark in the City of Light. Suddenly, there's the sound of gunfire. People scatter as a low 2-engine aircraft flies recklessly low over the famed Champs-Élysées. At its controls, Flight Lieutenant Alfred Ken Gatward has been ordered to drop a special load of ordnance on the French capital. A single tricolour. Within minutes, the British aircraft is gone. But the significance of this mission would ripple across France, bringing comfort and hope to an oppressed people, while striking fear into the hearts of occupiers and collaborators alike. Called Operation Squabble, the mission, which was thought up in 1942, was purely a propaganda-fueled attempt to encourage a fledgling French resistance movement. As the chance of success seemed slim, the job was given to a single crew to help minimise the loss of Allied lives. The mission would also be carried out by the mostly overlooked Coastal Command branch of the RAF. By 1942, the German occupiers were feeling less than easy living among the French browbeaten population. Although the collaborating French government out of Vichy was adhering to all the demands being sent from Berlin, some local German commanders still feared dissension across France. A ridiculous and arbitrary exchange rate between the French franc and Reichsmark had resulted in inflation, meaning the price of essential items had skyrocketed. At the same time, Germans were able to easily afford luxuries and were happy to contribute to a legalised act of national plunder. There was also a distinct lack of manpower across France, as thousands of French soldiers still remained in German prisoner of war camps. This lack of labour would be exacerbated later in the year when the Vichy government issued the Service de Travail Obligatoire, or compulsory work regulations. This forced labour initiative would see thousands of young Frenchmen forced to toil for the Nazi regime in Germany itself. The SDO also would push thousands more young men into the growing ranks of the French resistance. The food shortages and high prices also forced many young French women into the arms of their captors. Accused of la collaboration horizontale, these women would later be targeted by resistance members and publicly shamed post-liberation. However, for many of these mamzelles, a German lover can ensure that their family didn't go hungry. As with any occupied nation, Frenchmen who saw their womenfolk shacking up with the hated Germans felt their blood boil, and this eventually led to more and more acts of resistance. The suffering and low morale must have been palpable to the British agents planted in occupied France, as was the desire to fight the oppressors. But how could the British, themselves still less than victorious on many fronts, galvanise the French nation and show their solidarity? The perfect opportunity was communicated to London via an SOE agent called Major Benjamin Calvin. He reported that for several months the Germans had been holding elaborate parades on a daily basis right in the heart of Paris. For 30 minutes each afternoon, Wehrmacht soldiers would pound the pavé up and down the Champs-Élysées, ending at the sacred site of the unknown soldier under l'Arc de Triomphe. Could the British find a way to turn this show of strength on the part of the Germans into a demonstration of their vulnerability right where they felt most confident? In the way that these things generally happen, the proposal found itself on the desk of the energetic commanding officer of Coastal Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Philip Joubert de la Ferté. With the distant French heritage himself, Sir Philip instantly knew he had the pilot for the job. Due to the hazardous nature of such an attack, the RAF was unwilling to use its most advanced aircraft for fear that the latest technological advances be discovered by the enemy. Contrary to what I've heard in other videos and articles, the top fighter of the day, the Mark V Spitfire, could have done the job, but certainly at the extreme limits of its range. After all, a round trip from the English coast to Paris is something like 400 miles. And so, Sir Philip proposed using a Beaufighter, which, with its effective low-flying attack capabilities, would be perfect for the role. Once this proposal was accepted, Coastal Command approached Flight Lieutenant Gatward, who had a reputation as a capable pilot, to carry out the raid. He accepted, and along with his navigator radio operator, Sergeant Gilbert Fern, started to prepare for the raid. This involved low-level runs on a shipwreck in the English Channel to help the pilot improve his gunnery skills. The plan was simple enough. Fly at extremely low altitude across the English Channel and then overland to the French capital before catching the parading Germans out in the open and flying home. In reality, it would involve superb navigation skills and extreme nerve to pick a perfect course over low-lying obstacles and find a single boulevard and building in a sprawling city. Gatward explained in an interview after the war that,
"I'd never been to Paris before, but it looked exactly as I imagined it would. We studied a lot of guidebooks and photographs before we set out. We flew very low all the way across to avoid attack and saw masses of horses in the fields. The Beaufighter is pretty quiet and we didn't disturb the horses and cattle overmuch. But we took some photographs of them. Some of the horses were rearing up as we came over the fields, and one of them was a white horse, and you could almost see the whites of his eyes in our picture."
A secondary target was also identified right at the end of the Champs-Élysées, in the form of the Kriegsmarine headquarters near La Place de la Concorde. In an effort to increase the propaganda effect, the crew would also carry a French tricolour flag with them, which they would drop defiantly over the city through a flare shoot. To make it as spectacular as possible, the pair rigged up the tricolour, which they cut in half to produce two separate flags, with scrap metal to weigh it down. By throwing it off the top of a hangar, they were satisfied that both flags would be unfoiled dramatically by the weight when released from the aircraft. Gatward said,
"We experimented quite a bit with the flags before we started, and they were both weighted and folded, so that they'd stream as soon as they were released."
Initially, the raid was set for May 13th, 1942, but the mission had to be abandoned due to bad weather. The second attempt, about a month later, would not be cancelled, as the crew was encouraged to proceed to the target no matter what. Taking off again at 11:29 am on June the 12th, 1942, from Thorney Island in West Sussex, the pair were met with heavy rain all across the channel. This downpour dissipated towards the French coast, and by the time they were flying over Rouen, there was bright sunshine and excellent visibility.
It was a very nice day, plenty of sun, and we could see quite easily where we were going.
During the flight towards the French capital, the lone Beaufighter didn't meet any resistance, but light flak started to open up as they crossed the Parisian suburbs. Flying at just 30 feet for most of the journey made them incredibly difficult to hit, even for highly trained German ACAT crews. As they came closer to the target, the Eiffel Tower, their main landmark, came into view far off in the distance.
We could see the Eiffel Tower when we were 30 or 40 miles from Paris, which helped with our navigation, because we were much too low to have a look at Paris from above.
As they pulled a tight circle around the 19th century structure at around 12:30 and headed north towards the first target, L'Arc de Triomphe, disaster almost struck. Flying through a flock of birds, one hit the starboard engine and almost caused it to overheat. Gatward was unperturbed and continued with the mission. As they approached the monument, Fern dropped the first tricolour, which in a beautiful act of poetry draped itself over the symbol of French national pride. Gatward reported,
"We took a bearing from the Eiffel Tower and came in smack over the defence monument, and then headed straight for the Arc de Triomphe. I said to Sergeant Fern, my observer, 'Are you ready with the first flag?' And he said, 'Yes, I'm all ready, but the slipstream is nearly breaking my arm.' He was pushing this furled flag down a flare chute into the slipstream from the propellers, and at the right moment he let it go. However, we couldn't stop to see exactly where the first dropped, but Vichy says it fell right on the tomb of the unknown warrior, which is of course just where you'd want it to be."
With this first act of morale boosting achieved, Gatward circled to line himself up with the Champs-Élysées, which ran southeast from L'Arc de Triomphe. Getting right down into the boulevard at treetop level, Gatward's mix of 20mm cannons and .303 machine guns remained silent. The expected mass of German infantry was nowhere to be seen. Only a light throng of Parisians seemed to be out going about their Friday afternoon business. What was most astounding was that few people seemed to have noticed the British aircraft. With only moments to decide, Gatward switched to the secondary target. The former headquarters of the Ministère de la Marine, now headquarters of the German Kriegsmarine in l'Hôtel de la Marine. This opulent-looking building was nestled next to the Jardin des Tuileries and overlooking the Place de la Concorde with the Seine River behind.
One of the things we wanted to look at particularly was the Ministry of Marine, because it was crammed with Huns. We had something for them. We spotted that quite easily and turned north towards the Opera House, and then out again. On this first circuit, the people in the streets didn't seem to pay a great deal of attention to us. Of course, there was a certain amount of traffic in the streets, which may have covered up the noise of our engines. But there wasn't anything like the traffic there is in London, and we saw no motor buses in the Champs-Élysées. We didn't go very far before we turned for our second circuit, and this time we came in as low as we dare, in case they had any light attack on the rooftops. Actually, I was too busy watching out for chimney pots and steeples to notice any attack, but Sergeant Fern warned me that some tracer did actually pass close by us. The aircraft was not hit.
Gatward attacked the building with his guns while Fern prepared to drop the second tricolor as near to the front step as possible.
On this second circuit, we didn't make quite the same tour. We turned south a bit towards the river, so we could come square up to the Ministry of Marine. And we were right in line at a range of about 500 yards before we let fly with our 4 cannons, and saw the sparks flying off the building. We hadn't any time to see whether the shells burst inside, but a good deal went through the windows. We sprayed the place from base to apex, and we only cleared the roof by about 5 feet. Whilst I was doing this, a firm was shouting encouragement and pushing up the second flag, which we hoped would fall slap across the front door.
Although the damage that the Beaufighter could inflict was minimal, the shock it caused the German occupiers was both significant and comical.
We saw a number of German military cars stopped in the streets, with Huns standing around them, and others of them were dodging around the trees in the avenue. But we couldn't let fly at them because there were too many civilians about. Most of the civilians were waving to us. Fern says he saw some German soldiers trying to take cover behind a lorry. One of them was very fat, and he was shaking his fist at us.
With their presence slowly becoming noticed by the crowds below, the Beaufighter dropped low over the Paris rooftops and beat a hasty retreat back to the English coast. The crew landed safely back at Northolt just before 2 o'clock. The only known casualty on the Allied side was an unlucky French crow, which, probably being startled, had flown into the starboard engine immediately before the attack. Reportedly, it received a dignified burial in British soil, despite nearly ruining the whole operation. Both men were decorated for their daring raid on the heart of German-occupied France. Gatward received a DFC, while Fern was awarded the DFM. The expected parade was still about to go ahead, the scheduled start time having been incorrectly passed on by the SOE, and as a result of the raid, was cancelled. I have no sources on whether or not Operation Squabble put a stop to all similar parades, but even if it didn't, the propaganda coup likely tied down troops and aircraft which were put on readiness to defend against a similar raid in the future. As daring a raid as it was, did it actually serve any purpose? I think it's important to note that French and British relations at the time were not entirely friendly. In addition to the official French government's collaboration with the Nazi regime in order to maintain control of part of their nation, open conflict had also broken out between Britain and France. In 1940, Winston Churchill had ordered the destruction of the French fleet during the attack on Mers el-Kebir as part of Operation Catapult. This was in response to the French government's refusal to give up their ships to the British or a neutral power following the nation's capitulation. This event must have bred widespread mistrust of their roast beef neighbours across the Channel. The French Vichy regime would also combat Allied troops in North Africa later in the year. In addition to this, the French were generating their own myths about the great exodus of British troops from the beaches of Dunkirk. While in Britain it was a miracle, a moral victory in the face of actual defeat, to the French it was perceived more as a stab in the back and a full-scale abandonment by les Anglais. I believe that most average French citizens were more concerned about feeding their children and paying their bills. Resisting the Germans was a dangerous game to play. For example, on the 21st of August 1941, the German naval officer Anton Moser was assassinated by a member of the French communist group in the Paris metro. The first time the resistance had killed a German, the reprisals were extremely disproportionate. General Stuhlnagel announced the next day that for every German killed, he would execute at least 10 innocent French people, and that all Frenchmen in German custody were now hostages. As further assassinations were carried out, hundreds more innocent French hostages would face the firing squads. So perhaps it was fortunate that no parading Germans were killed in the raid on Paris. Perhaps onlookers would have been rounded up and killed out of spite by the humiliated occupiers. Undoubtedly, resistance movements across occupied Europe were a vital source of intelligence to the Allies and a way to bog German troops down far from the fighting fronts. We could also argue that the timing for Operation Squabble was important for the British and Canadian governments, which had another audacious scheme up their sleeves. Within 2 months, the Allies launched a raid on the French port of Dieppe. Were they also hoping to stir up the French people's will to fight, for this operation. Whatever the real impact of Operation Squabble was, it, and other operations like it, showed that the Allies were still in the fight and could reach and hit key locations almost anywhere in occupied Europe, even if it was just to drop a flag. So if you got this far and you enjoyed the video, then please do give it a like to help it spread to more people. And if you're interested in watching more daring acts of do, then check out this video that I've got on screen right now.